It's all right, dear. Just breathe. You're doing well.
There was never a choice, only the gamble. In the Middle Ages, pregnancy wasn't a blessing wrapped in swaddling cloth. It was a wager against death itself. One wrong night could end a life before sunrise. A woman might bleed out on the floor while her newborn lay silent, or a family could lose both in the same breath. So they did what survival demanded. They sipped bitter brews of herbs, knotted talismans at their waists, prayed to saints with trembling hands, and muttered curses to the moon when hope felt thin. There were no pills, no trained physicians, no mercy, only secrets. And this is how medieval women tried to keep a life from starting before it had the chance to end theirs. In those days, pregnancy was not a promise. It was a looming threat. Every woman carried the weight of cautionary tales. The cousin who bled for 3 days and never rose again. The neighbor who buried 5 infants before turning 30. The noblewoman who perished in silk sheets. The peasant who died on straw. They were equal in death's eyes when childbirth came calling. Now, before we go deeper into these hidden histories, tell me in the comments, which country or city are you watching from? What time is it there right now? And most importantly, what's your mood as you hear this story? I'll be reading your answers, so let's see how many corners of the world this history can reach. There were no ultrasounds to predict disaster, no skilled surgeons to intervene, no blessed relief from pain, no knowing if the child would turn, breathe, or take the mother with it before it crowned. Most births happened at home, in dim rooms where women screamed into the dark, attended by a midwife, a mother, or sometimes by no one at all. Outside, men waited, not for the wail of a newborn, but for the stillness that might follow. That silence was more telling than any sound. 1 in 3 women died from childbirth complications, infection, blood loss, eclampsia. The body gave way. Fever gripped. The priest was summoned. And yet, the children kept coming year after year, because there was no safe way to stop them, or none they could admit aloud. So, behind closed doors, women whispered. They whispered about roots and seeds, about timing, about things no priest would bless and no husband would understand. This was not rebellion against nature. It was the instinct to survive it. The first defense was not prayer. It was plants. Pennyroyal, rue, tansy, herbs bitter enough to twist the stomach and known to coax the bleeding. In gentle doses, they were amenagogues. In stronger ones, they could end a pregnancy entirely. Mugwort steeped in boiling water, parsley crushed into vinegar, wild carrot seeds swallowed after coupling. Nothing was certain, and everything carried danger. Pennyroyal could end a life, or stop the heart outright. Rue ate away at the liver. Tansy attacked the nerves. The difference between healing and poison was so thin it could vanish with a single extra sip. No one wrote recipes. There were no neat measurements. Only whispers, passed from lips to ears, guarded like treasure. Midwives held this knowledge. Some communities revered them. Others condemned them to flames when the church called it witchcraft. When they failed, they were cursed. When they succeeded, they were remembered in whispers as the only hope. And still, women drank the bitter cup, because the terror of dying in childbirth was greater than the terror of dying from herbs. They knew the risks. They drank anyway. Birth control was not only a woman's burden, but rarely was it a man's duty. Some tried, quietly, in shame. There were condoms, crude and awkward. The earliest, linen soaked in wine, vinegar, or herbal infusions meant to cleanse or block seed, reused until they grew brittle. Wealthier men had sheaths made from lamb gut, goat intestine, even fish bladders, tied with silk cords and kept locked away like contraband. They were rare, costly, and far from perfect. They tore. They slipped. They hinted at pleasure without purpose, a sin in the church's eyes. Husbands avoided them. Wives who noticed pretended not to. For soldiers or mercenaries in brothels and war camps, they were less about preventing children and more about warding off disease. But among couples, they were almost unheard of. No shop sold them. No pamphlet explained them. They existed in silence. When those barriers failed and a pregnancy came, shame followed swiftly. For men, it was a burden easily set down. For women, it was carried to term or to the grave. So women found other ways. Some pressed wool soaked in vinegar or honey inside themselves, a primitive sponge. Others shaped beeswax into shallow caps to seal the cervix. Olive oil, wine, or salt water was added to kill seed. Crude, uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but sometimes they worked. Cloth rags, herbal pastes, even dung mixed with oil. The goal was always the same. Place something, anything, between the womb and life. No workshop produced these things. They were made in kitchens, in barns, in the dim corners of stables, passed hand to hand in secrecy, and always the risks. Infection, burns, internal injury. But the knowledge persisted, crossing villages, crossing generations, carried in the breath of older women, murmured behind shutters. These were not tools of rebellion. They were shields. Shields not of iron or wood, but of cloth, wax, oil, and quiet defiance. Long before science spoke the word ovulation, women read the sky. They tracked their bleeding like farmers track the rain. They counted days, watched the moon, scratched tallies into beams, or marked them in charcoal on walls. Rosaries were fingered not in prayer, but to keep count. Knots tied in thread, rings worn on different fingers depending on the day. It was primitive, yes, but it was a start. They knew their bodies shifted, that some days sparked desire, others spelled danger. Without charts or thermometers, they followed a rhythm shaped by instinct and inherited caution. A woman might avoid her husband for days at a time, pleading headache, holy days, or fatigue. Sometimes he respected it. Sometimes he didn't. Nuns, midwives, and herbalists each developed their own ways to predict safe days. The moon was their compass, its phases believed to rule fertility, blood, and even the soul. Pagan lore bled into Christian superstition until trekking became ritual. But the body does not always bow to calendars. Hunger, age, fear, each could change the rhythm. One miscounted day, and the silence returned. This time, in the form of a missed bleed. The calendar was a clock without hands, and every silent tick was a gamble. And when knowledge failed, belief stepped in. Some wore amulets etched with protective symbols. Others carried pouches with dried weasel testes or beetles near the womb. Strange relics of pagan medicine. A girdle blessed by a saint might be fastened around the waist during sex. A woman might circle a fire 7 times, or whisper a spell into wine before drinking. Because in the end, in the Middle Ages, the war against unwanted pregnancy was fought with whatever a woman's hands could hold, whether it was a leaf, a prayer, a knot in a string, or nothing but hope. The line between a whispered prayer and a whispered spell blurred easily in desperate hands. Midwives murmured chants as they knotted sprigs of herbs against bare thighs, hoping roots and words together might defy fate. In certain corners of Europe, Women slipped scraps of cloth, stained with the first crimson proof of womanhood, beneath doorsteps, believing it would lock the gate of the womb. Others swore that hopping backward over a broomstick after the egg could jostle the seed free before it took hold. Was it magic? Was it folklore? Or was it simply the only rebellion left to a body ruled by men in crowns and men in cassocks? The church thundered against such rites, stamping them with the black seal of witchcraft. Yet it offered nothing in their place, only abstinence, or submission dressed as virtue. So women kept to their work in shadows, in whispers, under closed shutters. They weren't chasing miracles. They were clutching at control. Control that might come from a bone charm hidden in a skirt hem, or a half-remembered rhyme spoken into the dark. And when the charms failed, when the herbs were forgotten, there was one more chance, a crude baptism of undoing. Wash it away. Women would rush to the riverbank or crouch over a half-filled basin. Cold water, salt water, vinegar, wine, anything sharp, stinging, or biting enough to scour the womb. Some drew liquid into hollow reeds and forced it back inside, praying discomfort was a sign of success. Others sat bare over steaming pots of mugwort or wormwood, believing the vapors would smother the seed before it could root. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't secret, and it was rarely certain, but it was something, a ritual, a grasp at dignity, a moment to reclaim what had been taken without asking. Pain was routine. The burn, the swelling, the fevers that lingered like ghosts. But the silence, that was the truest punishment. No one questioned why she crouched by the basin at midnight. No one interrupted her third rinse. No one stopped her from binding her thighs shut with twine before bed, or drinking deep to blur the sting. These weren't myths. They were methods. They weren't dreams. They were desperation in action. And every woman who did them knew this might mean the difference between life and death in 9 months' time. The church's reach was absolute, even in the bedroom. Officially, the act was meant for one thing only, creation. Any hand raised against life, whether by herb, sponge, or the timely retreat, was sin. Sin that demanded confession, penance, and the threat of damnation. Yet reality played by other rules. Priests turned their gaze elsewhere when it suited them, especially for the powerful. Lords who dreaded 10 hungry heirs. Queens who could not endure another stillbirth. Monks who scribbled discreet notes on prevention in the margins of holy texts. Even clergy would murmur quiet counsel to midwives behind the confessional screen. There was the law of God, and there was the practice of man, and the two often nodded politely but went their own ways. Among the poor, secrecy was life itself. A peasant wife would never admit to steeping mugwort in her tea. A servant girl would not confess to soaking rags in wine for fear the punishment would go beyond the soul. It could end her livelihood or her life. A single whisper of which could exile her, or worse. Yet still they tried, because the church's alternatives were nothing more than shackles, celibacy, or surrender. And for most women, neither was possible. Behind every altar, in places unseen, there were cupboards not for chalices but for survival. Inside, wool soaked in vinegar, folded slips from midwives, bundles of roots tied with thread. They prayed for deliverance, but they planned for reality, because faith alone did not always save. Sometimes salvation meant defiance stitched into silence, and the dangers were merciless. Too much root could drown the liver in poison. Too much pennyroyal could stop a heart mid-beat. Heated stones scalded skin. Vinegar burned flesh raw. A splintered pessary could invite the slow death of sepsis. There were no antibiotics, no second trials. Some women died not in childbirth, but in their refusal to reach it. Others lived, but not whole. They carried the long shadows of chronic pain, the quiet grief of infertility, the slow bleed of a body forever changed. Was it God's punishment, fate's cruelty, or simply the cost of trying to steer one's own life? And even when the body survived, the village might not forgive. A woman caught with forbidden herbs could find herself branded. A servant discovered washing with salt might lose her position. A noble accused of defying heaven could find herself exiled to a convent or married off to a stranger. So they hid. They hid the bleeding, the limping, the hollow-eyed stares. They hid why a second child never came. They knew. The midwife knew. History did not care enough to know. Some men, though far fewer, carried a sliver of this burden too. Withdrawal, the oldest shared secret, passed from soldier to soldier, scribbled in the margins of medical scrolls, even named in scripture. Not noble, not foolproof, but practiced. Others struck quiet bargains with their wives, spacing the years, abstaining when the moon swelled, sleeping apart when the last child still toddled. A few kept their word, more did not. But the conversations existed. Among the literate, knowledge crossed borders in whispers. How Indian men used cotton plugs. How Arab physicians prescribed cooling diets to weaken seed. Foreign wisdom trickled into local practice. A rare husband fetched herbs, counted days, watched his wife's cycles with care. Not many, but some. And still, when they helped in shadows. A man who withdrew too often was marked as weak. A husband who waited was branded unmanly. A father who allowed space between births was questioned. Prevention was not seen as prudence, but as a failing, especially for men. And so the weight, as always, fell back onto her, onto the body, onto the blood. They were not rebels. They were not heretics. They were women building life rafts in a storm, because the shore was too far, and no one was coming to save them. What they did was hidden, dangerous, and often deadly, yet it was also ingenious, courageous, and profoundly human. They wove their knowledge into the shadows like threads into cloth, passing it from hand to hand, mother to daughter, without scripture, without signature, without thanks. And even when the world tried to erase their names, it could never erase their will. Because to claim even the smallest inch of your body for yourself, even through pain, even in silence, is to stake a claim on freedom. And that kind of freedom is something no priest, no husband, and no history could ever truly strip away. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think these silent acts of resistance were as powerful as open rebellion? Or do they risk being forgotten precisely because they were quiet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you believe these women deserve their place in history, and that the truth should be told exactly as it was, hit like, share this story, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Because here, we give voice to the unheard. We rescue the forgotten from the margins. And the deeper we dig, the more you'll see. History's loudest echoes often come from its quietest corners.